Hey, this is the Partially Examined Life, a special presentation. We're going to give a new introduction to a reissued episode. This was on Arthur Danto. You're going to hear us talk for a little while, looking back at the episode, relating it to what we're about to record on Roger Scruton. If you want to hear us talk more about this, go become a Partially Examined Life citizen, and you can hear the full-length nightcap, which this is excerpted from. This is an episode from...
Forever ago.
It's episode 16, 2010.
The original version includes quite a long preface before we even get to Danto. I am going to remove a good chunk of that from the public version. But in what you will hear that remains, there's still some reflecting on the project as it was back then and our attitudes toward academic philosophy. And that's all fun to hear how perhaps our views have changed. I don't know. Seth, you felt the strongest about that. Do you still feel the same about that?
Yeah. Some listener had said, you guys seem pretty angry and disgusted with philosophy for people who started to do it. Like, why do you hate it so much? And the net for me was that I don't hate philosophy. I just didn't want to do academic philosophy. I find what was happening in the profession, at least my perception of it 10 years ago, I haven't even been connected to academic philosophy in any meaningful way for many years now. So maybe it's just blooming with creative thinkers who are not simply engaging articles full of jargon and having disputes over minutia with each other. This is still my favorite episode, or one of my favorite episodes we've ever done. I think one of the more recent Hegel ones might be up there too, but this is still one of my favorites, precisely because I was so delighted by the reading and the topic and the fact that it restored my faith to some extent that professional philosophers could write things that were consumable and interesting. And then he, of course, did listen to us and made a comment about it, which was very nice, so I still love this episode.
Dylan, had you heard this one?
I had not listened to it. I enjoyed it. On the topic of sort of the intro and stuff like that, I was struck by how little the conversation has changed about how we think about the podcast and in general. And then also that it made me laugh because there was a bit of aspect, even with episode 16, like, oh, we've been doing this for a long time, which is funny now because it's, of course, 10 years later. It feels a little bit different than it would have on episode 16. But the content itself, it made me interested in looking forward to our upcoming aesthetics episodes. I thought, even without having read the Danto, just listening to it, it was just full of engagement with some really interesting aspects of interpreting art. And then I at least got a good flavor of a bunch of questions that I have had for a while, which is like, why is it such a big deal to be talking about art interpretation? And why do we have things that just seem so blatantly not art-like, or how do I make sense of them in modern art? And I thought that the context, even that's interesting that I would say that, the discussion of context as being the main point or a primary point in Danto's analysis, then parsing out what it would mean to have an end of art, an end of history. I remembered, this being a particularly, maybe even a more vibrant discussion. There was maybe it's come around numerous times. Fukuyama had this book, End of History, that had come out before this. I mean, quite a bit before this, but a similarly Hegelian kind of thing. And it reminded me that what you mean by history and progress, or as being imbued with progress, both how Hegelian that is, and then also how it just means that's a particular interpretation of what you would mean by history. And so you have to sort of get over the hump on that. I was inspired enough by it to spend time reading through this new Jasper Johns article, retrospective in the New York Times that came out this weekend, which was, I guess it was just serendipity. You guys mentioned Jasper Johns in the podcast as having been brought up by Danto in the context of modern art, and, along with de Koning and Pollock and all sorts of other people that feel very, very abstract. And there is a new retrospective of Jasper Johns, who apparently is still alive, at the Whitney in New York City. And there's a really nice It's interpretive, but it's interpretive in the way that's kind of explicative of this particular critics. He goes through his favorite painting by Jasper Johns, and then along the way, you get a nice, background on him and a lot of context. It made me really think about modern art more, but also realize that you just have to bring a lot more to it. It's one of the challenges with modern art is because the context is so much, it's even more required, I think. It's hard to have, or maybe the better way it lays bare your impulse to a knee-jerk aesthetic reaction, which is what I usually have. If it's, figurative or sort of realistic, you have that kind of interpretation. And then with most modern art, it's like, well, I like it. It appeals to me, but there's no sort of understanding. You have to bring that along the way. And I thought that article did a really nice job. It made me want to go to the Whitney and look at more Jasper Johns paintings.
That's cool. That's really cool.
Oh, as an aside, it's also a cool aspect of modern media that you can have such a cool multimedia presentation on the web. It's something that the web can be very good at, and they did a great job leveraging the ability to have a kind of almost like slideshow, commentary, lecture kind of thing. They zoom in on specific aspects of the painting while you could read the writing, the commentary on it. It was super awesome, super effective.
I'm going to have to go check that out.
I was struck with how much stinking work I did for this episode, that in addition to reading the 3 essays in Danto's book, The Philosophical Disenfranchisement of Art, he had an earlier book, The Transfiguration of the Commonplace, that I had looked through. There's this Calvin Tompkins book, The Bride and the Bachelors, which gave all these examples. I had read it as part of a previous aesthetics course in college or grad school, I think college, which gave a lot of those examples like you're talking about, Dylan, with Jasper. So I had more to pull on than I'm struggling as we're getting into these books by Roger Scruton. So a current professor, British professor, has written a lot about aesthetics, has 3 separate books on music. I started listening to one of them as an audiobook, and immediately he's getting into examples, which makes you want to stop and like play the thing. But it's hard to have that discipline. There's no other part of philosophy that says, wait a second, I'm giving an example of something. Why don't you stop and spend 20 minutes with it in whatever other form so you can actually appreciate the point I'm making? And that really, can slow things down quite a bit. But at least at this point, nearly 1 year into our podcast experience, I felt like I could do that.
You make that point, and I was reminded of, for much longer after this, your tendency to just voraciously consume amounts of material, which I would argue has only recently tempered. And I think it's probably because you have 3 other podcasts.
Yep.
Which is just a wonderful aspect, Mark, of your, you have a capacity to consume material.
And produce material, for that matter.
Which is just astounding to me.
It's the envy of all of your podcast mates.
So I had to do, as part of a book project that I have now turned in, and you'll be hearing more about that, do an overview of aesthetics, and was kind of struck by this question that we start with on the Danto episode, what is art? That seems like a very elementary question, but it's really a pretty historically recent question. There's a reason that we read this thing from the 80s, reflecting back on modern art that started in the 20th century, right? Early 20th century, that this wasn't something that philosophers cared about. And it's not something really that Scruton cares a lot about. He talks a little in his book. He basically considers, we spent a lot of time in this episode talking about Marcel Duchamp's sculpture, The Fountain, which is just a urinal. So you'll hear all about that in this Danto episode. But Scruton just refers to that as, it was a joke. It was a pretty good joke at the time. It's gotten increasingly worse as people keep imitating it. Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes and things, that is a not as good joke. And now when people do anything like that, just to sort of, what are the limits of art? Like they're throwing out this thought experiment for philosophers, just to like, I'm going to give you a borderline case. So you can try to decide, is this art or not? And thereby come up with a theory of what constitutes art and what doesn't constitute art. I think Scruton just finds that boring and tedious, and this not a particularly rich vein.
I'm looking forward to reading more of the Scruton. I did read that section that you pointed us to about the Duchamp, and I think I'm going to have to go and at least bite into a little bit of the Danto essays too, because it seems like they're talking about a similar kind of space with maybe Danto, both of them insisting that there are sort of standards for art that you can talk about, that there's a way to talk about good art and worse art. But Scruton seems to be less enamored of some of the tendencies of, I'll call it the Nietzschean tendencies of thinking about art than Danto is.
I mean, getting back to what Mark was saying, like, it's the thing about aesthetics as a philosophical discipline that you can't question whether something is a proposition. You can say, is it true or not? You don't say, is this or is this not a proposition? And talking about art, we think of it, say, okay, there's a work of art. Is it beautiful or is it not beautiful? But really, the question is, when you get to, is it art? You're moving the judgment from, call it the truth functionality or the beauty functionality of the object back to the status of the object itself. And that's perplexing, right? To think that you have a discipline or you have a universe of discourse where it's a question of whether or not a thing belongs in that universe of discourse, and people argue about it. I didn't appreciate that. It's what I thought made it a second tier discipline, so to speak, in the philosophical world, maybe taking the Platonic bias to heart. But now I find the fact that you can ask really subtle and interesting philosophical questions through that you can't with some other things in philosophy is actually really interesting, which is what I think the episode got us to.
Well, I think that's good enough for an introduction. Let's let folks actually hear the episode. Hope you enjoy it. It was really energizing hearing something from when we were younger people with more energy. You're listening to The Partially Examined Life, a philosophy podcast by some guys who were at one point set on doing philosophy for a living, but then thought better of it. My name is Mark Linsenmeyer, coming to you from Madison, Wisconsin.
This is Seth Paskin in Austin, Texas.
And this is Wes Allman in Boston, Massachusetts.
Our question for episode number 16 is, what effect should the avant-garde have on our understanding of what art is? Actually, that's one of many questions raised in the reading, which is 3 essays by the current American philosopher Arthur Danto, taken from the book The Philosophical Disenfranchisement of Art, including the essay of that name, the essay called The End of Art, and the essay called The Appreciation and Interpretation of Works of Art, first published as a whole in 1986. While the book is not, unfortunately, available for reading online for free, we posted a link to where you can purchase it if you'd like to read along at our website, partiallyexaminedlife.com. There is an essay that I'll link to, which was a excerpted chapter from a follow-up book that he wrote 10 years later or so called After the End of Art, that at least explains the end of art thing. I also saw some pages on there in the Amazon preview from his book before this one, The Transfiguration of the Commonplace, which has some overlap with this. Anyway, he's a big-time aesthetics guy, but wrote a lot of other stuff as well. In fact, I got a bunch of them out of the library, one called Connections to the World, The Basic Concepts of Philosophy, which goes through metaphysics and epistemology and gives somewhat of a systematic, I guess when you get to the end, I only looked at the first little bit of it, but gives a comprehensive picture of philosophy. And at least, but judging by the intro, it seemed pretty cool. He also just as recently as last year came out with a book on Andy Warhol, which is going to be very relevant to what we're going to talk about today.
Mm-hmm. And he was a critic for The Nation for a long time, right?
Yes, from 1984 to 2009.
Okay.
But now he's like 85 years old, so I guess he doesn't need to do that.
And let me say this to anybody who may be hearing this and going, oh, okay, this is Andy Warhol and avant-garde and all that. This guy is as much a philosopher as anybody that we are likely to study who writes in the 20th century. The fact that art is the milieu that he is using to discuss philosophy is simply an accident of a matter of, well, you know what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. Don't run away just because you hear the words Andy Warhol, which I would have myself.
He's a great writer. His writing is not in the spirit of Andy Warhol.
No.
Right.
No.
Not to say that Andy Warhol wasn't great.
Right. He is in the analytic tradition, Like I'm looking at some of the titles of his earlier books called Analytic Philosophy of History, Analytical Philosophy of Knowledge, Analytical Philosophy of Action. These are three of his earlier books, but yet has an appreciation for the continental figures and the things that I was looking for. And even in his essays, he talks about Schopenhauer. He has a whole book on Nietzsche, brings up Sartre and Foucault and all these cool guys like that.
He's a true intellectual, and a staunch Hegelian.
Yes, we'll get into that. There's a reason that we're doing this right after last time's Hegel and the Philosophy of History. And in fact, it might behoove you to stop listening right now and go listen to that one first. But we'll fill in the gaps if you don't feel like doing that. Before we get into that, here are some ground rules for our discussion. Number 1, we do not assume that our audience knows anything about any of this. Number 2, no gratuitous name dropping. We're interested in ideas, not in these dead philosophers themselves, or living philosophers in this case. If we have a point to make, we're just going to make it and not say, you'd understand me if only you had read Jean Baudrillard's All These Sandwiches Are Just Social Constructs. Number 3, we should be rigorous and exact in all that we say, except in cases where not doing so seems like it would be more entertaining. Let's move on to some viewer postings. Just to show you folks that if you go to partiallyexaminedlife.com and you post responses to our podcasts or other postings on that blog there, or you go to the linked Facebook page where there are discussions actively going on, it is possible that we might read something of yours on the air and give it a snide response. Dan B. posted on the partiallyexaminedlife.com blog. This was in response to, I posted the text of the inspirational speech that I put inspirational in quotes here. I'm abridging this a little. He says, listening to you guys talk with what seems to be irreverent humor towards philosophy is kind of amusing to me. Kind of. It seems as though you guys seem to view studying philosophy as the kind of pathology engaged in by people with some sort of obsessive compulsive or narcissistic personality disorders. You have reached the epiphany that the over-examined life is the cause of much distress. Any comment on that part in particular?
I'll just say that that's clearly in response to what you wrote. So
okay, well, what I wrote, the inspirational speech is not actually talking about academic philosophy and doing that. It is more just how unbearable I've been at various points in my life. And of course, it's exaggerated. He says, I'm not sure what happened to you guys at the University of Texas that led you to develop such a negative view of so-called academic philosophy. But I'm interested. From what it sounds like, you guys seem to focus on the arrogant personalities of the various philosophers and possible groupthink going on. I agree that many philosophers have a kind of know-it-all elitist attitude that from the outside seems grandiose and narcissistic. However, this kind of silly, puffed-up ego is common in a lot of educated people or people that view themselves as having a higher social status. Doctors, lawyers, professors, politicians, CEOs, etc. It is puzzling to hear you guys discuss philosophy in this way as though you were disillusioned with it and finally wised up that it was all a waste of time or perhaps just a strange kind of geeky pastime. I would love to have the time to study and discuss philosophy in the way that you guys were able to. I would view that as a dream come true and feel grateful and fortunate for the opportunity. So he's guilt tripping us for our cynicism here. Although I'm not sure I would view it as something that would lead to definite answers. Perhaps I'm misunderstanding you. However, I'm glad you guys have found an outlet for your love-hate relationship with philosophy. I don't necessarily agree with your philosophy of philosophy, but it is interesting and amusing. What do you think? Is philosophy, what is our criticism of philosophy? I know we don't all have the same take on this.
Yeah, Seth and I are getting lumped into your take.
Because it's the intro to the show, man.
I didn't know you were so unanimous.
Yeah, but I don't actually have that much against philosophy either. I think it's easy to try to piss on the parade of people who are having a good time being cynical. And so I'll just put that in this category. That actually I don't have much. It would have its ups and downs to do this for a living. I've exchanged emails with Jessica Berry, our former classmate, who recommended, when I asked what aesthetics reading should we do, she recommended this Danto, The End of Art. So you can blame her. She's some university in Atlanta.
And is she enjoying it?
And she said there were a lot of trade-offs, life-work balance issues going on. So, I mean, that's the same in any profession that you can either really give yourself to, that you're going to maybe be left behind in other respects. I'm sure it's an individual thing whether you can achieve that balance. So, yes, there would be downsides. It is a little weird to spend as much time, in the same way that it would be weird to become a comic book writer and scholar who just knows everything that Marvel and DC ever put out. That would be weird to spend that much of your brain power on that. But that actually seems like, when you compare that to other jobs, hell, that would be awesome. So,
yeah.
Or any other kind of niche field. But at the same time, does that mean that I'm dismissing philosophy as a geeky pastime? Well, it depends on what day you ask me. Sometimes it seems really important. Sometimes it seems like a calling. There's a reason that I'm so excited to read some of these texts again, and why, as we were just saying, not only then do so I've already read the essays that we're going to read in advance. Oh, well, let me just read some more background on this and some more background. Let me get 4 other books by Danto out of the library and see how much I can stuff into the last few days before the podcast. And, I just have kind of an addictive personality like that. And I guess it's better vented on something like this than, say, smack. I suppose.
Or IRS obsessions.
Although, Marcel Duchamp, one of the artists, the chief artist that Danto is talking about in these essays, refers himself to art as an addictive drug, and in fact, more or less got out of the business like pretty early in his life, and then just like was a curator for himself and for other people. So there are many people that treat philosophy the same way. Wittgenstein, right, described it as the fly trying to get out of the fly bottle, that like getting too hung up on these questions as necessary things, like you have to answer these questions, they're forced questions, seems like you're taking it too seriously to me.
Yeah, well, I was looking at the what is art entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and just because it's the one that discusses Danto, and it just becomes this, once you start getting into these necessary and sufficient conditions kind of things, that's where my eyes start glazing over. It's like, oh my God. Because of course it's endless, and it's you never come up with the definitive conditions for defining something. So
right, that's just to give some background. So many of these pieces of philosophy, like I would say that our treatment of the ethics, it's really hard when you're doing ethics to get away with this. Start with a definitional question: what is the good? And the expectation is that you should be able to come up with some criteria, that everything that fits the criteria will be the good or will be art, and whatever fails to fit those criteria is not.
Are you still talking about Dan B's response to your speech?
Not really.
Sort of segueing.
We're segueing.
I have something to say about it.
All right, go ahead.
Segue. So I think the mere fact that we're doing this podcast should indicate that we have a certain amount of respect. It's not simply some kind of like hobby. We committed to it quasi-professionally for a while, and now we're recommitting to it. It takes a tremendous amount of work and energy on my part to fit this in with what's going on in my life. So it's not something that I'm doing lightly or as an aside. I think what Dan, if he's picking up on any of those threads from me, what he's picking up on is my sort of general disdain for academia as a profession. Forget about what field you're in. The professional academician who writes articles about other people's articles and fills them with jargon, and who isn't committed to the search, whether it's philosophy for truth or is significant, meaningful self-realization or furthering the knowledge or the beauty in the world. That's the part that gets me, is that there were several people that I quite admired and liked that were professors at UT, and there were other people that just were checking off the boxes and doing work. And when I hear academics get involved in these conversations where they're just basically trading isms and arguing about minute points that really don't have any meaning to anybody outside of their area of specialty, it angers and disgusts me. So that's what you're hearing. But in terms of philosophy, yeah, obviously, I wish I didn't have to make a living either, and I could spend all my time doing the sorts of things that I did when I was in grad school. But there's no free lunch. I mean, nobody goes to grad school forever, right? Everybody enters the grist mill, and academia is just one form of it, as Mark mentioned. We all are going through our own versions. The fact of the matter is that I think what I'm saying is that given a preference, I'd rather do philosophy and do something else than do philosophy and be an academic.
Yeah, I have a very similar thing. And at UT, I think I took it so seriously and so personally. Philosophy was that important to me. It was always a huge conflict for me. Is this the right thing? Am I degrading the whole pursuit by professionalizing it, by becoming one of these people who's publishing for the sake of publishing? And it just seemed, it seemed like I was making some huge moral compromise. Now, I think, as I get older, I think,
that you'd love to make that moral compromise?
Yeah. And also I think, I think it's like in any profession, and I wouldn't want to discourage anyone from pursuing an academic career. I think you could do something good with that, and you wouldn't have to just be a
douchebag.
Yeah, and you wouldn't even have to go a research direction. You could end up teaching at a small liberal arts teaching college, and you wouldn't have to be forced to write kind of scholarly papers and things like that. And then thinking of Danto for this reading, he's did something that I would love to do. He's a critic for a magazine. So there are ways to.
He also was a professor at Columbia at the same time, just to be clear.
Yeah. But, and then his writing, and it is more, I guess you could call it technical or philosophical writing, like the stuff we read for this is beautiful. It's not just, it's artful itself. And I think you could be an artful scholar. So I think it's, people who are considering academia, you have to be realistic about it, and not even just the job prospects, just realistic about the pros and cons of it. And you can certainly, I think you can get just as much satisfaction outside of academia.
So, who, Seth, agrees with your comments about philosophy being so internal and kind of messed up? Why, Danto.
Arthur Danto?
Yes. In this, I have a quote here from the intro to Connections to the World, that metaphysical and epistemological text. He says, this is an intro that he wrote in 1997, even though the book as a whole is from 1989. He says, philosophy is baffling to those without its walls because philosophers communicate with one another, typically in dense technical articles, often inaccessible to readers illiterate in the notations of symbolic logic, addressing issues whose larger human relevance is as obscure as the immediate purport of the articles themselves. But philosophers, able, of course, to say what limited achievement is being aimed at in these communications, themselves may be at some loss in explaining what ultimate human purpose is furthered through that limited achievement. And the context here is he's saying that the history of philosophy in the 20th century has been a history of self-dissatisfaction, as its many internal critiques testify. So the Geist here that we are channeling is not even like an outsider's thing. Philosophers themselves feel this way. A lot of them. And even, we already talked about Wittgenstein, who wanted to kind of seemingly throw away the whole enterprise. We're going to do Hume next time, who has a similar motivation. Descartes, who thought a lot of what was said before was ridiculous and we need this firm grounding. Kant, so many people are going into their own systems because they think that there's something fundamentally wrong with philosophy as an institution, as an edifice, at least in their time.
Mm-hmm. It's always a crisis. It's always, why does philosophy look so bad next to science?
Let me give one more. This is just part of a posting from Dan M. on our website. This was in the discussion of the Eastern Philosophy podcast. And I think it was in the discussion of mysticism. And he was responding to my referring to people's beliefs about mysticism and their personal relationship with God. And I was probably less than reverent in the way I was characterizing them, though it wasn't too bad. And he says, after saying some, things addressing my points, I wouldn't want to denigrate anyone's religious beliefs or belief systems, however. In the course of our daily lives, all the mistakes and false assumptions we make about others, the world, and everything else, then to go out and call someone's belief in God foolish is to me a little arrogant. That implies we possess perfect knowledge. That seemed very much in the same spirit that Dan B's post was, which is being snarky is fun. So there's nothing more to it than that. In fact, it's entirely because I am a skeptic why I feel it's okay to be mouthy at the same time, right? Because I know that what I'm saying is just, this is just in the moment when I'm calling it like I see it. This is how I see it. And part of doing philosophy in this context is to, get things clear to yourself and talk out loud. And so I can't help but express my impatience with what some people believe. First, don't take me that seriously. It depends. When my plane is crashing, I probably call out for God the same as most people. And, this is the context. When you enter the Socratic arena, then you sort of open yourself to having your beliefs attacked. And I think people take having their beliefs attacked too personally, right? They equate their beliefs with themselves, like it's a judgment on their intelligence or something. When really, I would say 99% of what makes up you has nothing to do with your beliefs. We are so similar in so many ways. And the concept even of judging people's worth by their intelligence or their credulity or something, I just don't put a lot of stake in it. What do you guys think in that area? I would be respectful in real life to people is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think deprive the podcast of a lot of energy if we have to worry about people's feelings. Take this as in the spirit of blogs and podcasts. It's like a diary entry or a private conversation that you get to listen to. So
I think that's kind of artificially giving us power. The assumption that if we were having
we are almost up to 300 subscribers.
Yeah, exactly. No.
I think that most of them are pity subscribers. They just
friends and family plan. Yeah.
Well, but the point is that if you were walking by some crazy guy in the street and he was just shouting out things about your religion, you wouldn't think twice about it. If you're having a conversation with somebody in a cafe that you just met, you would have one kind of reaction. And if you were having a conversation with somebody you've known for a long time whose opinion you respect, versus going into, say, an auditorium and hearing a lecture by a so-called authority. And so I think what you're saying is that they shouldn't give your opinion any more credence than it's due and somehow put you in a position of making a judgment and acting as some kind of an authority about this, because that changes the perception of what's being said. If you're just some guy on a podcast, it's not that big of a deal.
And also, it should be taken in the spirit of a joke. It would be, Mark's not he's not the Christopher Hitchens of religion or the Dawkins. He's not here ranting about how stupid religious people are, in a serious way. That would be off-putting to some people. I'm sure to some people it would be a reason to listen, but I don't think that's happening. So.
Well, I think you're ruder about conservatives than I am, actually, Wes. So
yeah. Yeah.
What are you most rude about, Seth?
I'm not worried about alienating conservatives.
I'm not rude. That's the point. I'm the generous, nice guy. That's my role on this podcast.
You are so rude to rude people. I'm just sick of your intolerance of rude people.
Seth's the nice guy. What are our personas? Seth's the nice mediator.
Me? I'm the nice.
Mark's the snarky
My
one.
persona is escaping the notion of persona. I'm meta.
We all balance each other out in some
personas. Mr. Danto, let's do it. You were raving about this when we started, Seth, right?
I'm telling you that, so I would say aside from the first two podcasts, which were the Plato and the Descartes, the Plato because of the subject matter and because it kind of kicked everything off, and Descartes because of my love and passion for Descartes. This reading is why I'm happy to do this and why I'm enjoying it. It was a complete revelation and surprise. It came about, as you mentioned, through Jessica. So it kind of was one of these, it wasn't just kind of a stumble upon. It was a result of reinvigorating a social relationship and reconnecting with old colleagues and getting us into a modern thinker who I could respect instead of despise. And it's beautifully written, I think. Wes made the point earlier. He's a very, very good writer. And it's about philosophy. It's not about aesthetics. I thought we were going to have a podcast on aesthetics. What is art? What is the meaning of art? That sort of thing. And instead, what we have is a legitimate philosophical discussion that I think is extremely interesting and very well put and fascinating. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Yep. And it was hard to come up even with, a single question to encapsulate, because this is 3 different essays in a book that has some common theme throughout it. But, he does address some different issues. Really, his viewpoint was highly affected by the avant-garde. So he was a critic in the 60s when, Warhol and Jasper Johns, he talks a lot about, and Robert Rauschenberg, these were all people who were influenced by Marcel Duchamp again. He was really influenced by what the showing of these people's works did to the art world itself. So just as an example, should we talk a little bit about like the ready-mades and stuff?
Sure.
So some of this I got from, I have a secondary source that I'll also provide a link to. This was actually something, I read some essay by Danto. I don't even remember which one in the aesthetics class I took in undergrad. And then we also read part of a book called The Bride and the Bachelors, which was written in the 60s, 5 masters of the avant-garde. So it's these like 50 to 100 page biographical, but also sort of philosophical analyses of Duchamp, John Cage, a musician, Rauschenberg again, and also like a sculptor and a dancer, and kind of says a lot about what those people thought that they were doing. And to some degree, they were all trying to get past the distinction between art and life. And the senior of these was Marcel Duchamp, because he did most of his work like in the 20s, pretty early. He would do things like these ready-mades, which are, he would go buy a urinal at a plumbing supply store. and he submitted it to this museum showing, specifically because I think the museum had said, we're not going to be judgmental about what you guys are doing. We're just going to post everything. So he's like kind of challenging that. So he submitted the urinal as is. He like signed a name on it. It wasn't even his name, and submitted that and called it Fountain, which seems like it's just a joke. But then he went on to do this a bunch more times. So he has like hat rack and comb. So he calls these ready-mades at these things. And Danto actually takes this really seriously because it ended up, though, in that particular case with the first one, first of all, they just rejected it and said, this is not art at all. It's not that we think it's bad art. It's just not art at all. But eventually these things did get displayed, and they're part of, the thing that Duchamp is most remembered for, in fact. And so it was the fact that he was doing it. And so there's a lot of interpretations of how is this art? Like, it's conceptual art. It's not the thing itself. It's not like he went and built it with his own two hands and you can admire his handiwork. I mean, you could say, what a beautiful urinal this is. But, Danto argues against that. Really, like, Duchamp was trying to pick things that were aesthetically neutral. And in fact, he was challenging this whole notion that art is about beauty. Art is something more than that. So the question Danto gets out of this is, if you accept that this is an artwork, it looks exactly like a regular urinal. It's just one of them is posted in a museum and is called art, and one of them is not. So what is it that makes one art and one not art? Is it really just the being in the museum? Or could you have, somebody accidentally left there? Another one is a snow shovel. So maybe the guys who were shoveling the snow outside the museum, went in and left their shovels against the wall. Like, well, those wouldn't suddenly become exhibits because they were in the museum. So there must be something else. And so that's the question he's starting with.
The snow shovel has the witty title, In Advance of a Broken Arm.
Yes. Do you find that a challenge to your notion of arts, or is it just kind of a stupid conceptual joke that makes some point but is nothing too profound?
Stupid conceptual joke. Just going to throw that out there, Seth. Give a more nuanced view.
I have always had problems with 20th century art and understanding it. And I took a class in college that was about art that focused on the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And so I think my conception of what art was and the value of art was very much wrapped up in that. And I got very caught up in the ideas of viewing artworks in their political context and their social context and their economic context, sort of like there's lots of different ways to do art history, just like there's historiography, lots of different ways to do history, where you look at the material conditions that produce the art, you look at the social conditions around the artist and so forth. And 20th century art, I never really understood it, and it never really appealed to me. And it wasn't actually until I just read this book that I had any sense of why that was a problem for me.
You're including in that not just this wacky postmodern stuff that we're talking about, but modern art itself, Picasso and those guys.
I'd say yes, although with increasingly more degree as you get through the 20th century. So, for example, there's Picasso and Matisse and Klimt and guys that I can appreciate, or at least I have my own standard and my own way of judging and appreciating. But when you talk about Kandinsky and Miro and Pollock, the more abstract it gets, the less I was able to get a hold of it. And I didn't really understand why. And now I have what I would say is a much better understanding of why that were so difficult for me and why I didn't have a grip on it. By the way, that little bit in the article about Guernica that he leads off of and the disenfranchisement of art is just absolutely fascinating.
Tell us a little about that.
I think he's trying to make the point about what art means in context to the artist and to people who view the artwork will change over time. So he's trying to make a point about Guernica was made by Picasso, and it was intended to illustrate an act of terrorism or violence about this village. And Danto's claim is that anybody who lived at that time, who saw the artwork, would have recognized that what it was a kind of protest, or at least a statement about the violence of, I guess it was the Germans against this Spanish villager. And he quotes Picasso responding to a German saying something to that effect. But he says, to an audience even 20 or 30 years later, the historical context of what happened at that village and how this was a representation of that village is completely lost. It's completely gone. And if you don't know that this was originally intended to point out this atrocity that happened here, then how does the artwork have meaning to you? And what does it mean? He was trying to make a point about context and so forth.
Yep.
I just want to quote the German line thing because it's really, really funny. Picasso responded to the German officer's question, having handed him a postcard of the painting. Did you do that? And then Picasso responds, no, you did. So,
right.
I thought that was great. You know, it reminds me of my own experiences with museums where I have to admit I have a sort of problem. Visual arts for me aren't as powerful as say, literature. I guess I'm more into diegesis than mimesis.
Right, we're going to have to watch that going through this, that the visual art is his paradigm case. But, you know, there's supposed to be a story here about art in general.
Right, and he moves beyond.
I have a theory, by the way, about that.
He moves beyond the visual arts, and I think within this book, right, he moves on to literature. Last year, being in Italy, I'm trying to say I need the historical context. Now, I have to admit, when I was in, say, Venice, my favorite parts were like the armory and the dungeons and the
What?
Doges. So I'm really a Philistine in a way. And when it comes to visual art, I'm like that typical American that William James writes about, who just sort of glances blankly at not entirely. I'm doing myself a little discredit. But I'm trying to say is I need the handheld audio thing, or I need to be able to look at some description, and then I can appreciate it, or I need to bring the story of art or some short history. Otherwise, it's difficult for me to appreciate, and it's certainly difficult for me to go in and look at 14th century iconic stuff of the Virgin Mary and appreciate it at all. Because I am not a Christian, and I think even Christians today, because they're not Christians in the way that,
they're not that
say, a
Christian.
14th century Italian was, is it any longer a work of art to them? It certainly is not going to have the same power. It's certainly not going to be the communication, let's say, that it was at the time it was done.
So I feel like we should start with his central philosophical thesis that he lays out in The Disenfranchisement of Art, because I think that's really the central point to all of the stuff that we're going to talk about.
All right, let's hear it.
Go ahead.
So,
what's the thesis?
Danto's claim is that philosophy has disenfranchised art in the following way, beginning with Plato, that Plato is ultimately responsible for this, and that really everything, in the last 2,500 years or whatever is just an echoing of Plato. But basically what the net is that Plato says that the purpose of art is to represent things, to mimic or represent the image of something, and that where philosophy is responsible for trying to get at things themselves, art, by virtue of just focusing on the representation or the image of something, is sort of one step removed from that. So art is just by definition less central and less useful than philosophy because it's one step removed from the object. And in general, art has no utility because you can't do anything with art. It doesn't serve any purpose. A work of art doesn't shoe a horse or create a building or define a political...
People. That's all it can do is fool people.
All it can do is fool people.
You'd say, look at all these grapes I have here. Oh, that's just a picture of grapes. Ah, you bastard.
That's right.
That's all you can do.
So the term...
But it also can corrupt them.
Well, yes, it's dangerous, even though it's completely impotent, which is the central paradox that Danto brings up. But his key point is that the definition of art from a philosophical perspective, from way back when, all the way through Kant, everybody uses the same definition, is that it is mimetic, which means to say that it tries to mimic or represent reality, and it does so poorly, at least at the beginning. And so his philosophy of the history of art is that the history of art is the history of getting successively better and better and better at representing.
Well, and for Plato, it was especially bad because the objects of our experience are themselves pale imitations of the real things, the true forms of the world. But you don't have to be, a Platonist to still feel like art is epiphenomenal, right? It sits on the surface of things. It has no causal power. It has no, no utility. It's just a surface level phenomenon.
Yes. And if a huge part in modern times, if a huge part of philosophy is trying to get through perception or sensory data to the things themselves or to actual objects or to monads or whatever, then art is even doubly useless because it's just creating a barrier between you and even your sense perceptions.
Which, just to bring attention to something that's not visual arts, I was brought to mind when I read in high school, I read Brave New World, and this was like the paradigm case of a philosophical novel. And I really saw it as just poorly written philosophy. Like if you just throw away the art part of it and just tell me your philosophical thesis, then I would be able to evaluate it much more easily and actually discard it. I thought at the time that, that putting it in this story form and dressing it up like could only serve to obscure the truths, the alleged truths contained therein.
I actually like that novel.
I was a high school bastard. That's all I'm saying.
I understand your argument. It's sort of like the Ayn Rand effect where you have some thesis and you hit it too hard in the fiction. The message overwhelms the aesthetic, let's say. But I think, speaking of message and the aesthetic, is he rejecting the idea that art is impotent in the end? He only alludes to at the end of the essay to his transfiguration of the commonplace, which I wish I had started reading earlier so I could jump in and read some of that. But the structure of artworks, and this is on page 21 of the book, is of a piece with the structure of rhetoric. And that it is the office of rhetoric to modify the minds and then the actions of men and women by co-opting their feelings.
Let me just clarify. So the Transfiguration of the Commonplace was the book that he wrote before this one. In the beginning of the third essay that we read, The Appreciation and Interpretation of Works of Art, he says, this essay here that I'm about to write is the update of the Transfiguration of the Commonplace. In fact, you should read this instead of the Transfiguration of the Commonplace. Again, what the Transfiguration is like the snow shovels or the urinal, that this is a commonplace object and somehow we can interpret it aesthetically or present it aesthetically or something, and it is transformed into a work of art. And he wants to generalize that.
Yeah. The question is how that transformation takes place, right? Is it merely by giving it some sort of aesthetic features, or, what criteria could you say under which is it because it's a painting, it's has a mimetic quality, and so on and so forth?
Right. It is hard to connect this to the disenfranchisement part for me, that all three of these essays, he throws out this interesting discussion, but you're trying to figure out what exactly is his view on this? And he kind of doesn't get around to it until the end. And then you're not really sure.
He gives you like a one sentence allusion to his view. But
yes. So let's just give more of this history. Plato slams art as a copy of a copy. So useless. Say something. You probably are fresher on Kant than the rest of us, Wes. Right? Kant presented aesthetic appreciation as something that has to be disinterested, right? It can't be something that you're actually excited about. It's purposefulness without a purpose.
I don't see disinterest as a lack of interest. I see disinterest as, say, a lack of, say, personal idiosyncratic interests that are unrelated to the aesthetic value. So, for instance,
material
if you get
interests.
And this is related to his idea of freedom, where it's a difference between being subjected to the laws that emanate from yourself versus to some whimsical pleasure. So in this case, if you say, oh, I love this book, I connect with it so much, it's entirely about me and my personal circumstance. And what happened to the main character is just what happened to me. And if you can only connect to works like that, that's the non-disinterested connection.
Right. It's not aesthetic.
You're not having an aesthetic connection to it. Yeah. Which I think there's something to be said for that, right? I don't think Danto ultimately rejects this, right? Part of what art is doing is you could take things that are ordinarily ugly and painful and make them beautiful. Or say Shakespeare doesn't present the villains in his plays as merely cardboard cutout characters that you're supposed to hate, right? He creates empathy for those villains and he creates a sense of beauty for those villains. And that's the aesthetic standpoint. If you hate George W. Bush, let's say, and you go to a play about him, it's not really an aesthetic experience. If the play just bashes him and you're just supposed to reinforce your own hatred, that's a specific political or personal animosity type of interest. But if ultimately you could empathize with him as a character, and I guess this is what
the movie
what's his name did with the movie W. Yeah, and apparently he did that. Then you've sort of reached the aesthetic. So that's what I would say about disinterest. So I don't see it as being exactly about a lack of passion.
Well, the obvious one, though, is nudes, right? Are you appreciating the nude aesthetically, or are you appreciating the nude because you want to have sex with the statue?
Right. There you go. The other thing I'll say about Kant, which is only a vague memory, is it's connected to his moral philosophy, which is to say, when you see something beautiful, and I guess this is more easily understood with nature, the idea that anything is beautiful to us in nature is an odd thing, right? It has to be functional for us. It has to sustain us. It has to lead to our survival. But the idea for Kant that anything is beautiful, it gives us hope, even though, for Kant, he's still a skeptic. It's not evidence of God, or it's not evidence of a world in which natural law coincides with moral law, but it's sort of a hint of that. And so there's always this moral dimension to the aesthetic. And I'll just leave it at that, because that seems to be one of the implications of that sentence I read on the last, this modification of the minds and actions of men. What I don't know is whether or not Danto thinks that there's some moral dimension to art. For Kant, clearly there is.
Now I thought I remembered that Kant's, and this is the thing Danto was objecting to about it, we don't have to dwell on Kant too much, but is this vision of artistic contemplation as something that is divorced from practical action. It is something effete. Mm-hmm. It is something that's useless, in a fun way. And so Danto, again, thinks that's disenfranchising art. That's saying art is impotent to actually influence anybody's point of view in a way that, for instance, would make them take political action or something like that. To the extent that it's art.
And that's not the way I read Plato and Kant. And Danto himself points to this paradox, right? Plato thinks art is very powerful and he has to ban it from the city. He doesn't ban it entirely. Like, he has the guardians of the city listen to like rock and roll so they can get revved up for the fight. Different types of music affect different ways emotionally. Philosophy's trying to keep it under wraps because of its dangerousness.
Right. Yeah. He's saying that this attack on art as so impotent is not a sincere one, since these same philosophers, he really thinks that this is a dismissal. And he puts this as an ongoing fight between philosophy and art. I think we talked about in our first episode about the Aristophanes play, The Clouds, where he has an image of Socrates himself as being this, hopeless bungler who's completely detached from reality.
Right.
That this is an ongoing feud, and even says creating the science of aesthetics itself. That seems like, we're creating a special place in philosophy and we're going to think hard about these things. But by divorcing it from the rest of philosophy and creating this aesthetics, he compares it to putting women on a pedestal. Oh, they're so lofty and noble. Let's put them up here so that they can't actually have any effect on society and get involved with serious matters. So again, it's sort of making it ineffectual, effete.
It's actually
phenomenal.
Yeah. I mean, he says that, by the way, he has a little bit in there about Schopenhauer too, in case anybody's interested. But he says that it's interesting that philosophy is afraid of art and at the same time belittles it. And that the history of philosophy is the history of saying that art has no use. And when you say no use, it means it has no causal force and it has no utility. It can't improve the human condition. But then he says aesthetics was invented in the 18th century, a bold final stroke to set artists to creating aesthetic distance, which is to say that perhaps they finally got to the point where enough people complained and there was enough sort of realization, particularly after Hegel, who gives art actually a very critical place in the history of spirit, to say that, we need to give it some purpose, but it needs to be still disenfranchised. And so the purpose it's given is to create beauty. So the job of art goes from representing the world or mimesis to representing beauty. The job of the artist is to create beauty. And if you don't create beauty, you're not a good artist or you're not an artist at all. And he says this is kind of like the final beautiful stroke in this strategy to completely disenfranchise art.
Right. And we still have that strain very strong now, which is just to dismiss art as entertainment. Right. If it's not entertaining, then there's no art for art's sake. It's just subservient to these human needs.
Right. But I think there's always that tension, right, between mere entertainment and high arts and lower arts. I don't see the battle between philosophy and art is the question has always been, what tool is better for getting you to reality, right? For dealing with the real. Like you can as Aristophanes does, you can criticize the philosopher for being completely out of touch with reality, for looking up at the stars while stumbling in potholes and being completely impractical, or you can say of the artist that they're just, doing copies of copies. So that seems to me to be the fundamental battle. The disenfranchisement part, where philosophy's attack is the subtle undermining by treating art as ineffectual, I'm not so sure of that. Again, I think that it's pretty clear that Plato sees art as something very effective and dangerous. So.
Yeah, to be clear, Danto doesn't say that this is what art thinks of itself or what the rest of the world thinks of art. It's what he thinks philosophy, the history of philosophy.
Well, I know. Which I'm saying I'm not sure that I see that. Because that's aestheticism, right? That's just saying that the power of art, which I think was a relatively recent movement, right? The divorcing of art from any moral dimension, where I think people, look at the origins of painting and music. They're in the church, and they're meant to be ways of worshiping God. And so I'm not giving a definitive criticism here. I'm just saying I'm a little bit confused about historically the idea that the tactic that philosophy used in its battle against art is this disenfranchisement tactic.
Well, let's maybe accept his thesis and see how he responds to it. So again, he answers very briefly at the end of the essay, and I think it kind of had 3 points to it. One was, really, you could conceive of philosophy as growing out of an artistic impulse in the first place. Right? Why do we want to explain something? This spiritual urge that gives rise to philosophy is essentially an artistic urge, something like that. He doesn't really go into that, but he at least throws it out there. Like, this is at least, Aristophanes' side of the story in the long running feud. And then he points out these parallels, sort of the second response, which again is not much of an argument, but he's kind of trying to get you in this frame of mind to dismissing the attack here. Which is that, like, the Wittgenstein that we read, or specifically the logical positivism interpretation of Wittgenstein, dismisses philosophy itself as something that is epiphenomenal, something that can have no causal power, that is just, parasitic upon real things, the imaginings of idiots, more or less. And he suggests that, like, if you don't buy that, maybe if we can reform aesthetics in this way and redeem it and give it back its power, we can do the same with philosophy, right? Which is not so much of an argument of why you should necessarily do that or that these really logically hang together, but there's certainly a parallel there he's pointing out.
Right. Philosophy is hoisted on its own petard if the same attack that it directs against art ends up swallowing it.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what he's saying. Is he saying that the accusation of being causally useless, it could be levied against philosophy, and that the collapse of art into the philosophy of art, the ironic end of art is that it becomes philosophy itself, and then philosophy is going to have to come to terms with its own ineffectualness.
Well, this was the hardest part I thought about this, is when he starts talking about how he has this Hegelian view of art history. And so last time we talked about Hegel's view of history as distinguishing history, like the narrative of what's really going on with the spirit of a culture, from the actual events. In fact, there are many events that happen that are not historical, right? Because he thinks that they don't contribute ultimately to the movement of the ideas of the culture forward to the next kind of culture or whatever. And in fact, there are whole cultures, he thinks, that are just historically irrelevant, which seems pretty freaking obnoxious. But he wants to at least use that setup and say you could conceive of artworks in the same way, that we've had these historical movements in art history, and that in a certain point, and he thinks it's that he identifies that the point where you have Duchamp making his ready-mades and the people that followed him, where you've now broken the machine of progress. Right? Where you could conceive of, there are always some artists that are off doing their own things, but you could look at art history as this movement. And he gives a picture of it as, becoming better and better at representing things. But then actually the hitch in the story is that when photography comes along, then at least visual art can't be about that anymore. So it changed to expressing things. But then when you get to Duchamp is not even trying to express anything. He's picking something that somebody else made. And so he's like purposefully picking something that his own emotions are not going into, which is what, modern art, Picasso and those folks were trying to do, something that a camera couldn't, to sort of show you the events how I see them or something like that. And they've got more and more abstract. So you have these guys just splashing paint all over things in a very expressive way. That's modern art. And postmodern art, that he points out, is supposed to be the step beyond that, where museum curators don't even know what to call art and what not to call art. In fact, everything is permitted. And so consequently, he thinks since then, there haven't really been artistic movements. There's just lots of individual artists doing their own thing. Maybe something will look like a movement here and there, but it really doesn't contribute to an overall progress forward.
They are their own movement.
Yes.
It's a movement of one.
Right. You have to judge each of them by their own standards to something like that. So he's got that picture of art history, and that's what he calls the end of art. In other words, the end of art as a progressive discipline as we've seen it before. But how is this supposed to work with the disenfranchisement? Well, on one hand, you could say Hegel is part of the attack, right? Because you could see what Duchamp is doing is it's no longer about the work anymore. You're not supposed to gaze on the urinal. Duchamp was explicit that he wanted to make art not about the retina anymore, not about seeing things. He wanted to make it about the mind. He wanted to bring it back to thinking about stuff. So in other words, it becomes philosophy. And reading this whole, a good chunk of this Bride and the Bachelor's book, talking about Duchamp and these other guys, I didn't feel so bad. It's just a book with text. It has a couple little crummy black and white illustrations in the middle, but it barely mattered because I feel like I was getting almost everything you're supposed to get out of these works without even seeing them. Because it's totally just descriptive. It's entirely intellectual.
Right. I only looked up the Duchamp picture of the urinal like while we were on the podcast. It didn't even occur to me to look it up,
Yes, so that's his point, Mark, that the tie to the disenfranchisement is this. As long as the purpose of art is to be representational, it's tied to an object. And how well or poorly the representation occurs and the development of the representational, which is really a development of technology. He talks a lot about the invention of perspective, for example, and then the advent of photography and the moving picture and so forth and so on. But as soon as you divorce it from representation and it becomes expression, so that it's supposed to express some kind of emotion or feeling or what have you, then the object becomes irrelevant. And that's when you get the abstract expressionists who are trying to represent something without any object whatsoever.
I represent my rage.
Yes. And once you're divorced from the object, because expression is an expression of human feeling, and human feeling hasn't really changed. I mean, people got angry back 4,000 years ago and they get angry now, right? I mean, then there is no construct to guide the refinement of art as an expressive form. It just merely is each individual artist becomes expressive of their own individual experience or what have you. And you can't even necessarily relate the vocabulary or the grammar of an artist's work with any other artist's work unless they have some sort of real world experience that's shared that they're speaking out of. So the end of art just means the end of art as representation. And then it just starts to spin its wheels.
Yeah, because it goes beyond, it's the end of art as expression as well. Because the Duchamp, it goes beyond.
Well, it's the end of art as a social form.
Abstract expressionism is not the end of art either. That's still
true.
The end of art is when you get to the urinal. And
No. Well, yeah. So no, what he says is that
you arrive at the urinal.
What he says is that the expressionism marks the end of art as a representational form, which is to say the end of art history. But he says that the theory of art as expressionism is ultimately doesn't explain what you need to explain either. And that's the problem, is that right now there is no theory. But his point is that once you remove the object from art, then it becomes a purely theoretical exercise.
Right. So it's not the urinal that makes it art. It's something, because a regular urinal is not art. So the question has to be, what is added that makes it art in this one circumstance? And so it's like, what makes it art itself is nothing.
Well, no, what's really important is exactly what you guys said, which is I could tell you, hey, this guy just went and put a regular old urinal into a museum and called it art. And you could engage with that as a work of art, just as if you were standing there looking at it. It's purely theoretical. It's a purely theoretical exercise. And at that point, the object is irrelevant. Then all you're doing is talking about the theory of art, in which case that's what he means by it collapses and becomes the philosophy of art. Is that he says that when artists stop actually creating art and they just start talking about the theory of art, then that's where we're at now. Like, that's the end of art.
Yeah, and then he talks of the interpretation becomes constitutive of the art object, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Just to quote him on 111, At the end is theory, art having finally become vaporized in a dazzle of pure thought about itself, and remaining, as it were, solely as the object of its own theoretical consciousness. Which sounds very Hegelian.
So the question is, though, so you can interpret this in two ways. You could interpret this as part of the disenfranchisement. It's just kind of philosophy that's alienated from itself. It hasn't yet realized that it's philosophy. But I actually read the end of this essay that he's actually saying that the fact that art contributes to philosophy in this way, right? Art is a historical form when it comes to realize itself is actually what has given it its power all along, or something like that. He's trying to enfranchise it by saying it is important, like philosophy, right?
Wow, I didn't get that at all.
Well, then how is raising this at all a response to the disenfranchisement? What the fuck is his response to the disenfranchisement at all? I see at the end of this essay, he's pointing toward the rest of the essays, which are, again, a lot of what really the change in understanding of philosophy itself, not even just philosophy of art, but philosophy itself. And I really was hazy on this when you get beyond the art itself, that really there's something important contributed to here that, like Hegel thought, so Hegel sort of thought that art is part of a late stage of any given culture, and it helps the culture to understand itself. It is one of the ways in which the culture sort of gives itself information about itself and comes to recognize itself, and therefore come to fulfill its destiny, its internal blueprint. Mm-hmm. So art becomes this kind of communication, really, which means it is useful. It's not socially useless. The fact that we had the 60s and, the rock and roll and the avant-garde stuff and art and all that stuff that was going on in the 60s, you could say, oh, there were these political realities that's really what was going on. And then the art was just kind of on top of it. But no, really, the art fed it as it was going. It intensified it. It helped it point in a certain direction, such that that's the way we understand the 60s now, is because we, have the Rolling Stones and the Doors. And if we're so snooty as to be into modern art, we have Warhol and many more obscure folks like Jasper Johns, he talks about, in Rauschenberg.
Yeah, the question is, he seems to be endorsing the end of art, right? And the new role that art has after the end of its history. Because the end of art doesn't mean the end of art per se. It means the end of art as a historical development,
as a struggle to figure out what it is. And remember what that meant when we were talking about Hegel last time, that maybe we interpret the historical progression of the United States as a struggle to realize its identity as a liberal bastion of freedom, as we're, once we actually extend real rights to everybody, and then America will become what it really was supposed to be in its essence. Of course, people interpret this in different ways, what the genesis that we're supposed to grow toward is. But in any case, you could see artists doing the same kind of thing.
Or he gives the comparison to Marx, where you no longer have these specialized technicians, right? Once history has come to an end, you're a fisherman in the morning and a cobbler in the afternoon. Or I'm a little confused, like you. What is the status of art after its history? Is that something he's endorsing? And what does it mean about its efficacy, or about how does it transcend disenfranchisement and all those questions?
I think he's saying that there's an answer still to be found. I thought the point of this was that, he was saying the art world. He uses that term in quotes quite a bit, right? The art world.
He invented that term, actually.
Okay, so he invented it. But
he coined that, yeah.
The point is that people have been floundering, and there's a lot of confusion, and the art world is now dominated by dealers. And he was trying to make sense of all this and understand why 20th century art is the way it is, and why expressionist theory has failed to articulate what art is. And so he does this historical, what he thinks of as almost Nietzschean, like exegesis, right? Where he talks about, some genealogy of art through the ages. And what I thought was really interesting was that he says the reason the 20th century is the point at which all of this turns is because of the moving picture. That as long as your focus is on representation, the moving pictures, aka movies, do a better job of representing reality than paintings or even photographs ever will. And so essentially what happens is that representational art in the form of painting, which is really what he's talking about in this, by the way, he's not talking about literature or poetry or anything like that.
Right.
Hands over the mantle to movies. And it's just a question of how far technology is going to carry movies, which is, by the way, appropriate given Avatar just recently coming out. There's a lot to be said about that.
Well, and home 3D setups and
So his point is that painting as an art form essentially handed over responsibility for the continuance of the history of representational activity in the art world to moving pictures. And now it's lost. And so the first thing people tried to do was come up with was this expressionist. That, oh, well, it's not representing, it's expressing. But that's not satisfactory. And that's as far as I think he gets, Wes, is that I don't think he has an answer.
But also, by the way, I think he does set a limit to representational. You know, he talks of the holograms and then the things that you could touch. There is a conceptual limit. It's not like we can conceive of an endless development to representational.
Well, and we wouldn't
progression.
Want to. We wouldn't want smell-o-vision necessarily.
Well, no, what happens is that
or breasts that you can touch that feel like breasts.
Well, then real life becomes art. I mean, that's the logical conclusion of this. That's the logical end is. Anyway, my point is that I don't think he has an answer, and I certainly don't think he's providing anything affirmative at the end where he says that essentially art becomes philosophy. It's kind of like taking a stick and poking philosophers and saying, okay, well, now I can explain what happened. What happened is that art became completely self-reflective and became completely theoretical and not about the object and all about its theoretical construct and its historical context. And hence, it's just basically philosophy. And now philosophy is going to have to deal with it. After 2,500 years of disenfranchising and poo-pooing and, making art a second-class citizen, it has to realize that art is itself philosophy. And oh, by the way, what does that tell you about yourself? Bertrand Russell and Carnap and all these guys.
Well, I can tell you what. So I read, and we'll link to a chapter from a book that he wrote 10 years or something later called After the End of Art. So he kind of summarizes what he meant in his End of Art essay. So art ends where pluralism begins. So again, the art history was a bunch of movements, and they were very dogmatic and nasty. And I remember this. I was in kind of composition school. I was a composition minor. So this is in 1990, something like that. And people were very dismissive. If you tried to make something that used regular tonality, that sounded like Mozart, like they were just, you're not serious. You're just doing something imitative. You need to be on the cutting edge. And at that point, I think already Danto would say that that's a confused notion, because already by 1912 or something, Schoenberg, when he came up with 12-tone music, this absolutely unlistenable, like mathematically written, unexpressive, stuff. And then following that, John Cage, right, describing in the Bride and the Bastards, who just kind of threw out tonality altogether and wrote all these percussion things and sounds from real life. He really would have been all over like the sampler and electronics. And in any case, with the visual arts, even at the time when I guess this is in the 60s, that, there was a thing against painting, like painting is dead. You have to be doing sculpture. You have to be doing film. You have to be something. Whereas now that's kind of all blown up, that now that there's no sort of objective criteria that they could point to and says, we, the art world, say this is where art is at right now. And if you're not doing that, then we're not going to put you in the museum. Now he describes it as new students of art now see the entire art museum as potential sources of inspiration and imitation and combination, because in some way everything's been done. So everything going forward now is creating these idiosyncratic expressions, creating your own little languages. And this is not a bad thing. It actually means that the institutions of the art world, which were kind of what he was objecting to here, can't be as dogmatic and obnoxious as they used to be. It makes a lot of sense in terms of the way classical music, this, whatever the th version after Schoenberg, the stuff that I was getting trained in, is so culturally irrelevant.
Right.
That what you get now are people playing with cultural tropes and maybe, hopefully, if they're smart, trying to do something idiosyncratic and personal and cool with it. After the End of Art, we have Pluralism. And he also connects that with the fact that women were finally let into the art world, the fact that minorities were finally let into the art world. So like, again, in music, which I know best, the fact that you now have all these world sources that are suddenly open. You could put gamelan music in your stuff, and it really sort of radically equalizes the playing field in some way. It makes it very hard to be snooty.
So it's no longer about being shocking or trying to do something new. Isn't that going back to some sort of cultural relevance? I mean, as in pleasing people, or, I'm thinking about the fact that there's a famous essay from the 80s about the death of poetry. There's always a death of this or that. The average person used to read poems, and they were published in newspapers, and they were actually enjoyable. Now it's like 3 million poetry journals, and poets write poetry for themselves, and they have readings, and it's just a few people. It's a little club kind of thing, and
like ventriloquists.
Like, I would never pick up a poetry journal and start browsing through it. Just first of all, because there's too many, and you would never know where to begin, and also because when you do, it's agonizing.
There's something more offensive about bad poetry than there's about bad pictures.
It's like getting stabbed in the gut. It's like one of the few. It's like, it reminds me of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where the race of
the Vogons
who come to destroy the Earth are also the worst poets in the world, and they can torture people with their poetry, except for one, like, 13-year-old girl on Earth. And luckily she was destroyed with the Earth. There's some quote to that effect, which was great. Yeah. So when you say that, Mark, I'm wondering is he advocating for art that's more friendly to the masses, or that's no longer this sort of little art world type of, let's see what's shocking kind of thing?
Right,
or,
it's post-historical. I mean, it's no longer art for art's sake. It does serve human needs. And he says there will always be human needs. The need to express yourself, the need for entertainment and communication. I mean, so he's really not dishing this whole, the culture talking back to itself. Like, that is itself a useful ongoing need that we have for art.
And that goes on endlessly, right? There's no termination to that.
So again, it means that, like, the end of history for Hegel, the end of the development of a certain culture for the US, according to my little analysis, it means when we finally work it out and stop fighting. For world history, it means the wars will finally end. So the end of history is actually a good thing. Because it means we're not fighting over crap anymore, and we can finally live in peace and do what we like. And that's where he thinks art is now. And, what the relationship between that and commercialism, he doesn't really go into. Do we then have to please everybody? Like, there are definitely certain economic realities to it. So whenever you get rid of a canon, what is left? And we already said, like, I've complained about the canon in philosophy, but the fact is, if we didn't have the canon, then how do we know, in the limited time we have, how do we know who to read?
Yeah, and he gives hints that he's against relativism, right? There are real aesthetic judgments to be made. Right. And there's a difference between the popcorn thriller and, say, Bergman or something.
But the fact that we're doing this episode, I think, says something against, Danto is just too recent to be in the canon, even though he's somebody that, like, if you take an aesthetics class, you'll probably read a Danto essay of some sort. But still, picking this was to some degree a leap of faith, and at least it seems the consensus here that it was a good one, that you don't necessarily need. We're still working based on the recommendations of others, but I don't know if you'd call it a canon exactly.
Well, he's a good candidate for the canon.
Is that so? That's all it comes down to.
A canondidate.
We haven't defeated the canon. It's just that the canon is still in development when we're considering current people. Is that what you're saying?
It's mind-boggling to think about the newness of civilization, let's say, or people who've only been around for a few thousand years doing what they do, and as time goes on, just the endless accumulation. I mean, already now it's overwhelming, the accumulation of things that you might read, and how do you narrow that down? There are going to be things which are held up. Some things are going to survive, and I imagine that some of the things that are part of the canon now are simply going to slip away and get replaced. Within a human life, there's only enough room for reading so many things, and I think there'll always be some sort of competitive positioning between what gets read and what doesn't. No?
We certainly have the urge to canonize, so I'm just thinking of rock music and the way I think of it. That, it's like not just like Beatles, Stones, Kinks, but in Prague, it's Yes, Genesis, King Crimson. It's it's the Cars, the Police, the Talking Heads for early 80s for me. Like, it's Radiohead, Weezer, whatever. It gets harder when you get more recent. And certainly these things are not going to, even though, ironically, now we have these recorded musical works, and these are the things that are going to be available to people 1,000 years from now, potentially, unless, things get wiped out. But assuming we have good backups and don't, upgrade our hard drive so far that we can't read any of this old shit anymore, like all this stuff is going to be accessible. All the books and things now that are being digitized and all these recordings. It's interesting to think of what culture is going to be like. Like, will there be room for, I remember I read a book at one point. I can't remember who wrote this, but it was a science fiction book about an organization that goes around and systematically destroys old works of art to make room for new ones. So like, so that tonight we get rid of all films that feature James Cagney. We don't have any room for those. Wow. And this is just something that new artists demanded be undertaken, because otherwise just nobody would give a crap about their stuff.
Wow.
Okay. So that's the post-historical art and his idea that he's giving a Hegelian view of art history. Does this address the disenfranchisement? He's saying philosophy has been dissing art all this time, but no, now that we've gotten past, now that we can truly see what art is, which is something that it's not aesthetic contemplation of the product in isolation. You have to understand what culture it's from. You have to have some idea of what the artist intended. At least, is it intended to be a work of art? And he has all these talks about these different versions of the same object. It's not even just with the urinal, but even just, there are a lot of painters that did canvases of all one color. And he gives this example in one of the works, I don't remember, of somebody who gives like the Stations of the Cross in a very abstract way. And in one of the panels, it's just like all black. And this is supposed to be like where Jesus gets crucified. And it makes sense in the context of the narrative, but it certainly doesn't make sense in isolation and is indistinguishable from other all black panels. And he gives many other examples of things that, in fact, he wants to generalize this. It's not just urinals and stuff. You could imagine for any piece of art, maybe this thing, in fact, a sculptor in ancient Greece created this, but maybe this was just a geological accident. Or maybe this is something that a modern sculptor put together to look like something from ancient Greece or something. There are always multiple origin stories for a thing. And unless you know what the origin story is or something of the interpretation, then you don't understand the work of art. So he's trying to get rid of these bad views. It's not just appreciation of the representational nature of things. It's not just appreciation of the emotion that's being expressed through the thing. In fact, you have to sort of pay attention to what the artist's goal was. And this is more me talking than him, but I think that's the only way you can evaluate the quality of a work is to see what the artist's goal was. And then you can evaluate how well it pulled it off. Otherwise, you're comparing two things that are not trying to do the same thing and saying one of these is deficient in this respect. And I see this all the time in different shades of pop music or whatever. Like, oh, this, I don't like this. This is not catchy enough. Well, it's not supposed to be catchy. Or, this is not cool and cutting edge enough. It's cool in a different way. Like we have that pluralism already, even in so-called popular music.
Are you saying this is your actual opinion?
This is my actual opinion about music, at least, because I've thought enough about this. And I guess my only complaint about, I think, calling the 60s in particular the end of art, and now we're in this post-historical period, I think you should be really suspicious of anybody that thinks the pinnacle of the movement that they're concerned with happens just at the time they happen to be looking at it.
Yeah, I agree with that, but at least he has a theoretical construct to support his point of view. And he's basically just saying that this is a realization of Hegel's point. But let me say a couple things about that, Mark. So the first thing is, he is only talking about painting. No matter what he says, music, literature, poetry, sculpture, architecture, dance, these are not things that are encompassed by this view. So that's one thing, is that he may be using the word art, but what he means is painting or variations thereof.
Into sculpture, into the visual.
Yeah, I'm not even sure how far it extends, because in my opinion, and this would be if I was in the mood to write an article and refute an 85-year-old genius's point of view, I would say that he basically says the transference of the mantle of representation from a painting to motion pictures, which is, I think, very clearly laid out in that essay where he says he's talking about holograms or holography or what have you, means that art hasn't ended. The quest for representational accuracy still exists. It just doesn't exist in this medium. So what has happened is that painting as a visual representational form has become irrelevant because technology has superseded it, and its only function is in representing objects, and that now that role is played by somebody else, which is, in this case, is photography or motion pictures. And so this particular art form has come to the end of its useful life in the history of art, but that you could argue that the history of art is not dead, the art is not dead, just painting is dead. And that Avatar is a perfect example of this quest for representational, because it's actually literally doing, which is taking the next step from a two-dimensional representation to a three-dimensional representation with all this technology. And, by the way, it's the story of how people represent themselves in a more visceral way. It's like the technology in the movie is essentially the next stage beyond three-dimensional motion pictures, because you put on some plugs in your head and then you're in this virtual world, right? Virtual reality is the culmination of representational, what is the term that he uses?
What, mimesis?
No, he's got another way of saying it. Perceptual equivalency. That's it. So perceptual equivalency takes the next step forward when you move from painting to photography, from photography to motion pictures, from two-dimensional motion pictures to three-dimensional motion pictures. And its final step will be from three-dimensional motion pictures to virtual reality, as long as you can throw in, I guess, smells.
Well, Caprica, are you familiar with that? So it's like the new version of Battlestar Galactica or whatever. Like, that's the premise to the whole thing, is somebody has invented, these goggles that let you essentially go to some virtual space. And then, in fact, all these teenagers go to it and like shoot each other and have sex and stuff. And like, that's the first thing you do. And because you can feel it all, but it doesn't have the danger, so this is, of course, in many different books, and, it's a very hot sci-fi topic.
Right. And what I would say is that, well, I guess when I said earlier that then when real life becomes art is when you basically, it's the final culmination. Self-realization in this case would be, or self-consciousness would be, the realization that your life is a work of art. Your sensory perception and your actions in the world are themselves works of art.
They are, or they can be transformed into works of art if perceived in the right way or something.
Well, all you have to do is perceive them that way. So when you perceive your own existence as a work of art, that will be the full self-realization, self-consciousness, and self-fulfillment of representational. And that will be the true end of art history, or the true end of art.
Well, and he did write a whole book on Nietzsche, which we had said one of the major interpretations of Nietzsche is live your life as an art, sort of create yourself as this larger than life character of your own design.
It's 96 and 97 where he's talking about palpability, the next step in after holograms, palpability.
Yeah.
When, however, palpability should become a technical possibility. And there is a serious question of whether palpability could ever become integrated into narrative sufficiently to suppose an artistic development beyond the technical one. So it's unclear that technical advancement will always lead to an artistic one.
Is he trying to say that porn movies do not have a narrative? It seems they have a definite build-up and a climax.
No. What he's
bad porn movies have a narrative.
Boring porn has a narrative. Actually, no, Wes, that's the same section where he's talking about how the artist chooses the subject to show off the medium, that the ideal medium for moving pictures and all that stuff would be stampeding cattle and all that. But that if you were to take that next step into actual visceral experience, that would really not be the appropriate thing, because the last thing you'd want to do is get stuck in the middle of a cattle stampede. So a Western makes for a good movie, but it wouldn't make for a good virtual reality. Which, by the way, and his constant reference to
the cattle run through you.
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead, sorry.
And that, by the way, to your
You'll
point,
actually be killed by cattle.
To your point, Mark. This is also the section where he refers to breasts, I think, 3 or 4 times during the course of this essay. Like, is it art because now the morals allow us to show breasts instead of not showing them before? Is that the advancement of art? And it's like, no, that's a moral or political thing. But in that same section on page 97, Wes, he says that narrative is necessary to keep an art form alive.
Right. I was just about to read that.
Yeah, that when, for every perceptual range R, the equivalent could be technically generated, then you have the end of art, which in its equivalency in science would be when everything is known, which was a fantasy of the 19th century that was possible, that we would eventually get to the point. It was just filling in the details of physical science and pretty much we'd be done. He says the equivalent in art would be when you can represent anything 100%.
And he says there's no internal reason for us to think that science or art has to be endless. So the question would have to be faced, what post-progressive life would be like? So you're saying it's over for painting, but not for art in general?
I'm saying that if you buy this premise that the history of art is the history of representational perfection, that painting was a stage and it has passed over to moving pictures, yes. So
painting clearly
but he says
is clearly
that
best. But
not only did that notion of art as accurate representation sort of self-destruct internally through the history of visual arts, but that it obviously was not a good theory of art because it doesn't apply to, say, literature. Like, how could there be advances in how well you can represent things in literature? Like, if you say in the future, we'll have, 3D, we'll have smell-o-vision or whatever, but you can't say in the future, we'll be able to say, we'll be able to describe things more accurately or whatever, because if you can actually even describe how that future would look, you are doing it. You're describing them more accurately right then.
So no, I think you're right, Mark. I don't think he agrees that the representational theory of art is the right one. I think what he's saying is, philosophy, this is what you've signed up for. For 2,000 years, you have claimed that this is the case. And guess what? Now it's ending. It's coming to its self-fulfillment. He's a Hegelian in this respect. And he's trying to throw this back on the philosophers. And in fact, that point about language, Mark, that he says the limitations of natural language as a descriptive have always been acknowledged, that there's never been any room in language for progress. It's not like we're going to evolve to be able to say things that we couldn't say before, is a dig at philosophy. I just get the sense that he's taking this idea and he's pushing it to its logical conclusion, and that he's trying to point out how absurd the whole thing is, but also to kind of throw it back in the camp of philosophers to acknowledge, which is why it's so unsatisfying, which is why these essays don't end with him going, oh, and here's the solution to it, right? He's trying to explain the phenomenon of what's happened in the 20th century, at least in certain aspects of the visual arts, but he's trying to do it from within the context of traditional philosophy as well. And so when he said something like that, like, oh, well, natural language has never been able to admit of progress, he's basically saying, that this relegation or this disenfranchisement of art by philosophy has at least given art something to strive towards its natural fulfillment. But philosophy doesn't even have that going for it, because all it does is play with language, because he's certainly alluding there to the 20th century philosophers of language and philosophers of mind who were playing with these concepts.
I thought he was, he's all for moving beyond the definition of art as being progression in technologies of perceptual equivalence, though, right? Which with fiction and plays and poetry, you get beyond that immediately. So that the end of art came as soon as people were writing. That was the end for that. You do have innovations in technique, which is another discussion altogether. But
or you could see the end of literature coming as soon as you could represent anything. As soon as you have movies, like, well, why the hell do you need literature anymore? You just watch it instead. You don't have to use your imagination.
Well, I don't think the end means you stop doing it, though, or partaking of it.
No, you're absolutely right.
It means that it's no longer fulfilling the point that it used to. Of course, just as practical matter, what's great about books is that they can be so long and they can be so rambling, and just the way that we take them in is different than TV. Like, we just don't have to sit in real time and listen to somebody, even if it's just things read aloud. Like, God, that would take so long. I can read, I can skim, I can jump around a page. There's just obvious advantages such but that also, you would not see the point of literature is just to tell a story. And now that we have these new representational, improved representational techniques of film, you don't have to tell stories in this way. So books are obsolete.
But also, literature puts you in the mind of the protagonist, right? You're part of often an inner monologue, which is not sustainable in movies, except in bad movies. Right? The voiceover becomes really.
You could have Ferris Bueller really turn and address the camera. Because he's so postmodern.
Right. But it's not the same sort of thing. So you're much more present within the inner experiences and thoughts of the protagonist in a piece of literature.
I got to say, though, the advance from movies to like ongoing series really is, I think, doing more to undermine books. Like, it used to be like, how could you make I remember reading something that it was about the Fire and Ice series, George R. R. Martin. You familiar with that? it's kind of like respected as like the next Tolkien after Tolkien. And there was a question like, well, how could the authors that, will your books ever be made into movies? And he's like, well, one of my books is like 5 times as long as Lord of the Rings. Like, see how long Lord of the Rings had to be. Well, his first book is becoming an HBO series because they can make it freaking 40 hours long. So, there is something to that. If, that's not going to replace philosophy books, although maybe philosophy podcasts
They can't replace books. It's a different, I'm not going to not read The Lord of the Rings because I saw the movie or shitty movies that everyone else loves. But anyway, I would love to see like Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. I would love to see that made into a movie.
It seems like culture as a mass is disagreeing with you.
No, I think people still read. Look at the Kindle and the whole ebook reader. The technology conference this year, the consumer electronics thing. I mean, just the market is glutted with devices which are designed to read books.
The market is okay.
What were you going to say? I want to hear something cynical.
I'm so
almost did it.
I'm so sick of technology. I can't even tell you. The market is flooded with solutions in search of a problem. I mean, 1,500 exhibitors at CES, and how many of them have marketing departments that have actually bothered to find out what customers and people actually need? That's the thing that's just frustrating.
I can say, though, that I think the iPad is a
Apple apologist. You know what?
Great.
I have an iPhone, and when my
I'm not an Apple apologist. I've been looking. I've been buying the shit like tablet PCs. I've been evaluating these technologies for years. I am obsessed, and I think this is finally something that's workable. And then there's another thing called Notion Ink, which uses this new Pixel QI technology, so you can revert between LCD and e-ink type displays. So you have the best of both worlds. You could be outside in the sunlight and you have video. It's like Harry Potter style, like the newspaper. It's e-ink, but it's video. Fucking incredible. Anyway, I'm remorselessly obsessed with these. Well, I'm not remorselessly. I have a lot of remorse actually, but my obsession with technology.
Jamming this back to Danto here, I guess I want to interpret Danto pluralistically. Just like he says that the state of visual art now is pluralistic, that I just don't like Hegel's version of history as having to have a single defining narrative for a particular culture. That seems to me very elitist and bullshit. And that was what I didn't like about his world historical individuals and all this stuff. The truth is that history is a lot of different people doing a lot of different things. They have some commonalities about them such that you might want to write them down and talk about them more later. There are certainly calamities and things that happen that affect more people than others and are more noteworthy, but it all matters of why you want to bother to talk about something. So that, for instance, you might not consider the succession of chancellors at a university as being, even though those are the leaders, it's just like learning the presidents in the order that, high schoolers are supposed to learn or something. You could say if you're really into that university, you might learn all the chancellors in a row. Well, it's hard if you're outside that framework to think about that being, historically significant, the history of the university, thinking about it, the leadership in that way. However, you could very easily look at instead of looking at the chancellors of Harvard, you could look at the progressive degree to which minorities were allowed into Harvard. And that becomes actually a big cultural touchstone that relates to so much of the rest of the culture. And maybe, the way that I've described, America moving forward to realize itself. So, Hegel described a different kind of history as that, not talking about a universal history or a philosophical history of a culture, but focusing on one thing. So if you're focusing on this particular story that people were telling themselves about the visual arts, yes, okay, it blew up at the point when we had not only Duchamp, but we didn't talk about these other guys. For instance, Jasper Johns was a guy that did a lot of paintings that were like paintings of numbers. Those aren't representational. If you draw a number 3, it's not a picture of a number 3 that exists in the outside world. It is a number 3. Where he drew flags and things, so it was all trying to make the artwork the thing itself. Or Robert Rauschenberg was a guy who tried to move more away from painting into sculpture because he wanted to bring more of real life things in it. He would put actual Coke bottles and things. One of his famous things that it's actually a picture in The Bride and the Bachelors is a stuffed, an actual dead stuffed goat stuffed into a tire sitting on this platform that's kind of a painting but made out of magazines. This is one of his, it's not a painting anymore. It's an object in the room. Or Duchamp, the fact that he had a hat rack, and people would come in and hang their hats on and like not understand that that was a piece of the art. And he did the same thing. Andy Warhol. So in his whole book, he tells the whole story with Andy Warhol just filming, like he wanted his films to be like a security camera, like just leave it on.
His films suck.
They're unwatchable. Yes, but it was this whole trying to make art into life. Well, so I'll accept this as the story of a progression of a particular idea and a particular social movement then breaking down. But at the same time, even with any given society, there's all sorts of other stories that you could tell equally well that have not reached their climax in the 60s, for instance. And even just like within particular shades of music, for instance, it seems like every part of music like hits an avant-garde phase at some point. You got prog rock at the end of the 60s. You got hard bop and these crazy kinds of jazz like at the kind of the beginning of the 60s. You've got classical music hitting that in the early 20th century. I'm sure, rap or whatever will hit that eventually. These just seem to be sort of recurrent movements in different things that they don't all add up to a big picture to me.
I lost your point. Yeah.
You're saying there's going to be endless innovation? Is that it's not an innovation in terms of technology, obviously, but it's innovations in terms of form?
Right. Well, Hegel has this model of history of the culture coming to understand itself.
Right.
I feel like with every generation, so much of that understanding of the previous generation is lost, that every generation has to come to understand itself and does so through its culture. This is exactly what Danto is saying. Like that art is one of the methods that a culture uses to communicate with itself. And it's not just like Hegel would say, the penultimate stage toward philosophy or whatever. It's like just part of an ongoing process, I feel. I don't know to what extent I'm contradicting Danto or what extent I'm agreeing with him because he's so fucking vague.
Yeah, that's true. I think I don't know either. Yeah.
Can I read the last page of this book in here? I know that this is from an essay called Art, Evolution, and History. So this is just the last 2 paragraphs of this whole book. He recommends at the beginning, even though these are discrete essays, they're published different times, they sort of read like a narrative and you should read them in order. So here's what he says. For the indefinite future, art will be post-historical art making. It would be inconsistent with this insight into history to look for a further history for it. Now, the further history is for philosophy to take, and unlike art, philosophy is something that will have no post-historical phase. For when the truth is found, there is nothing further to do. Nothing could be more dismal to contemplate than philosophizing without end, which is an argument that philosophy is not art and that pluralism is a bad philosophy of philosophy. My aim has been to show how art has been the means to philosophy at both the ends of its history, but here especially when in transforming itself into its own object, it transformed the whole of culture, making a final philosophy possible. It served as an evolutionary means of the highest sort. Asked what artists we might breed for, my answer is those with the keen sense of play that survival in the art world now demands. The more important question is what philosophers to breed for, and my answer is those who can give us the philosophy that art has prepared us for. I am but their prophet.
So this is a very Nietzschean conception of the art philosophy fusion, right? Not to mention the reference to being a prophet.
Yes.
Let me read something related on page 45, the end of the appreciation and interpretation essay. Mine is a theory which is not in the spirit of science, but of philosophy. If interpretations are what constitute works, there are no works without them, and works are misconstituted when interpretation is wrong. And knowing the artist's interpretation is in effect identifying what he or she has made. The interpretation is not something outside the work. Work and interpretation arise together in aesthetic consciousness. As interpretation is inseparable from work, it is inseparable from the artist if it is the artist's work. Anyway, I guess the point is philosophy will be done through art in the post-philosophical period, or that's the only expression it will have. And
I don't know.
I don't think that's the interpretation.
No, I don't think that's what he said.
No, of what you just read, Mark.
I don't know.
Once the truth has been found, that would be dismal to keep on philosophizing, and the only way to philosophize is to do it through art.
No, I don't think that's
what he just. Isn't that what Mark just read?
No. What he said was the opposite of that. It's that art becomes philosophy, not philosophy becoming art.
Right.
Well, it's both. There, he's talking about the end of philosophy. Is that just something that doesn't happen, or?
No, he says there's no end of philosophy. Isn't that what you just read, Mark?
No. He says there will be no post-historical phase of philosophy. When the truth is found, there is nothing further to do. And he says that the fact that art has reached its end now makes it possible that philosophy might actually end, that we might figure out everything. And it seems in other places he kind of makes fun of this as like one of the goofy things about Hegel. So I don't know how seriously to take this at all.
Well, in one of the essays we read, I remember it, but I didn't write it down. He has a kind of throwaway comment about this post-historical phase. He says, some people used to call it heaven. This thing about, basically, I think it's in the same section, Wes, where he talks about being a fisherman in the morning and a carpenter in the afternoon or whatever. Well, I'll tell you, there's this vision of the afterlife. I think it comes from Dante, but it's persistent across numerous other authors, right? Of that, what you get to do when you die and go to heaven is just contemplate God, just sort of bask in the glory of God and contemplate his perfection for eternity. The Jews have something similar, that once the Messiah comes, Israel will be transformed into this land of milk and honey where you can just sit around and read the Torah all day and you don't have to do anything else because all you have to do is dip your cup in a river and it's like manna, and all this. And I've persisted in thinking that I couldn't imagine anything more horrible than the afterlife or heaven, someplace where there was no conflict, no strife, no change, no mutability, nothing, right? Like the whole concept of permanence, and that is just awful.
And it comes across that way in Dante and in Milton, although I think Milton was doing it intentionally.
Yeah. And so,
because you're supposed to empathize with Satan and how interesting hell is and how boring heaven is. But sorry, go ahead.
No, I think that's a good point, is that part of the way I read it is that he's saying this is where we are with art. We're at this place where, because there's sort of, let's just call it art in itself, or art that is trying to self-realize, and then there's the stuff you do to put paintings on walls and jewelry and further the economy and that kind of thing, that in post-historical world, there will still be activity. Art will still be being created. It just won't be being created towards any kind of purpose of self-realization. And so when you hit that point, there will still be artists making things and people selling them and buying them and putting them in museums and all that kind of stuff, because that will never go away. But none of that stuff will contribute to kind of the self-realization or the furtherance of art as a concept. And so art ceases to be about creating art, and art becomes philosophy. In other words, it becomes thinking about the concept of art and talking about and using language and what have you. And what he's basically saying is that move into language games and away from the actual practice of generating works of art is basically just a move into philosophy, because that's what philosophy is. And the problem is that philosophy has not seen itself as this kind of thing. It tries to pretend. The 20th century history of philosophy has been, at least as far as the analytic tradition is concerned, an attempt to pretend that it is science and to beg the sciences for attention and credibility. So if he gets to the point where it's like art becomes philosophy, maybe philosophy will realize what its true calling is, which is to be self-reflective and to do all these things and get away from trying to be experimental or be psychology or be linguistics or whatever it is that it thinks it is. And that we might get to the point where philosophy actually self-realizes, but at that point you're done because of this, this notion of truth. Once you accomplish the truth, there's nothing else to be done, which, by the way, I don't agree with. But in this context, I think that's what he's trying to say.
Yeah, I don't think there's a conceivable end of philosophy. And I thought he thought that at one point, because he mentions the intractability, for instance, of the mind-body problem or other stuff like that. Insofar as art becomes philosophical, though, even after the end of that pursuit of truth, right, that would be the only outlet. And so as art is the reflective activity, the post-historical art becomes your outlet for reflection.
Maybe if he's saying that after a certain point, art is, when it was in the representational phase, art was about the object. And he says at a certain point, it's actually before the postmodern phase. It's in the modern phase. It became about, like with Manet or, those guys, it became about art itself. It became about the means of creating art, about the brush strokes themselves, about look at my technique of the cool way I'm Picasso and I will show you the way I see things, and different artists will show and he thought that reached its infinite in like Andy Warhol, who's just totally ironic in a way he's presenting something. I guess, so after a certain point, all art is self-referential, but the thing is, it doesn't have to be merely self-referential. So Andy Warhol was doing stuff that was ironic and playing with the notions just like Duchamp was. But whereas Duchamp, there's really nothing more to it than the urinal. Andy Warhol was doing things that he also himself found aesthetically pleasing, but in a new idiosyncratic way. So the equivalent for Andy Warhol of Duchamp's ready-mades was the Brillo boxes. So these grocery boxes that were supposed to be things that would, he made a few different kinds, Mott's applesauce and stuff, but he saw like what the kind of boxes that things were delivered to grocery stores in, like that would be in a stockroom. And he wanted the feel of being in a big stockroom with a lot of these things in it. And in fact, he even thought that getting the actual boxes wasn't effective enough. So he didn't use actual boxes. He reconstructed them using like plywood so he could make the whole stack of them. But this was for him, it wasn't like Duchamp picking an aesthetically indifferent object like the urinal or the comb or something. For him, it was, this is what about the everyday is aesthetically effective for him. Like he liked the idea, these sort of American cliches, these, pictures of Nixon and Mao Zedong, these things from pop culture. That's what the whole pop art thing is. And with the, he says, I like repetition. I like the feeling of emptiness that you get when you stare at, something kind of plain for a long time. I like the warmth, so he painted the very famous painting of Campbell's soup cans. And in fact, he liked to eat the same thing every day, like, cause he liked that reassurance. And so that's a very aesthetic, but it's like a very self-conscious, ironic aesthetic. I guess the thing is about irony though, is that the difference between ironically putting forth something as enjoyable and actually enjoying it very frequently disappears. Like I think inevitably disappears. Right? So when I'm feeling pretentious about my own music, I'm like, oh, I'm playing with these cliches of rock and roll and big drum hits and things, and I'm putting them together in a way that is, unique to, even though it might look like your very ordinary pedestrian kind of rock and roll thing, there's something self-reflective going on here that makes it all the cool. But you know what? I'm actually not that pretentious. And even if there is some more reflection going on there than many other people who are not obsessed with philosophy put into theirs, I still enjoy the big snare hit for the big snare hit. And I think that's sort of the direction. It's not that with self-reflection, art dissolves. It's just that self-reflection becomes an element that is added to art and enriches it. That's all. So post-historical art, whether visual arts or other things, can use all these techniques from the past and be, consciously molding them together. It has a different attitude than before. It leads to a greater understanding of ourselves and our relationship to art, right? That art is not just calling that is pulling us to reach toward truth in this fundamental way, truth with a capital T. It's pulling us toward, truths, that I can do psychotherapy by writing a song about something. That, these are utilitarian in a way, but that doesn't make them any less deep and important.
I thought you were much more of an elitist than this, Mark. What about this thing at the end of the disenfranchisement of art, where he talks about the structure of artworks is of a piece with the structure of rhetoric, and that it is the office of rhetoric to modify the minds and then the actions of men and women by co-opting their feelings? Is that an endorsement of sort of a propagandistic role of non-disenfranchised art or the new art? Or
well, it's only propagandistic if it's a government trying to pull one over on the masses by doing this. But if it's people communicating,
that's too strong.
Right, if people communicating with each other, then that's legitimate.
Right. The point is there's a dimension there which goes beyond play, right? The idea that art is now going to be effective, and it sounds like politically and morally effective.
Wes, are you talking about the end of the first essay, The Disenfranchisement?
Yes.
Yeah, page 21.
Yeah, so I thought what he was saying there was that the way philosophers treat art is similar to the way that they treat rhetoric, or at least specifically Plato and that. And he says, but at least rhetoric has a purpose, which is to persuade or influence, whereas philosophy's purpose is to prove. And so he says one move out of the representational. One could think of art in the same way as rhetoric and think of it as potentially being persuasive, that's like an out you could take if you wanted to show that art can be influential and have an impact on the world.
But he seems to be, he says directly, if I have been right in my arguments for the transfiguration of the commonplace, the structure of artworks is of a piece with the structure of rhetoric. It's not a...
Yeah,
He seems to be saying something fundamental about...
that doesn't seem like a very strong statement to me. All that says to me is that it's similar.
Anytime he starts this last paragraph, I'm not sure that the structure of rhetoric and the structure of philosophy are of a piece.
Well, that's in contrast to what he says about art. He's saying art and rhetoric have the same structure, but he's not so sure about philosophy and rhetoric.
Sure.
Yeah, but he doesn't say art has the same purpose or end or function as rhetoric. He says the structure of art is of a piece with the structure of rhetoric, which is as weak a way of saying that as I think you could say it, right?
I thought it was a very strong way of saying it.
I don't know. I mean, to me, this
of a
this
piece
marks,
means to
this,
me, of a piece is an idiom for the same.
Ultimately, what he's trying to get at is a different way of viewing art, the arts, according to much more diverse criteria. So it used to be that there was a way that you were successful in creating an art. You know, does it fulfill, according to the art world of the time, what art for art's sake is supposed to be doing? Whatever the hell that means. And now that that's gone away, now it has to fulfill specific human purposes, which means that it's not just that any old interpretation is good, that any work can be successful. It really has to deliver the goods on some particular thing it's trying to do. So I just saw the movie Persepolis. You ever see that? Or it was a graphic novel, and I've heard of it. Yeah, it's a
the Iranian,
right? It's a biographical thing about growing up under the Shah, and then when the revolution came, and what that was like. And the purpose of that is to communicate what it was like to live in this area. Well, that really was successful. I now understand way more what's going on there.
That could be communicated more or less artfully, right? There has to be
right. Yeah. So you could say
successful communication, and there's unsuccessful communication.
Exactly. Right. There's a temptation when, art as it was conceived before has hit a brick wall to say, well, then anything goes and it's all just bullshit and it's all like whatever your interpretation is. And he wants to say, yes, there are multiple interpretations for things, but they're not all valid. There are multiple ways of being successful at art, but any old way you do things, it's not just because you're doing it that it becomes a successful artwork. That's what I'm getting out of this whole communication.
He gives the whole anti-relativist spiel.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to get at.
Some interpretations are right and some are wrong. He explicitly says that.
Now, he does have an essay that we didn't read where he distinguishes between surface level interpretations, which is actually what he's been talking about here. Like, did the artist mean this to be a piece of art? Did the artist think you knew something about the French Revolution? Those are kind of surface level interpretations from deep interpretations where you're like, what does this art tell us about the society that this guy was living in? What are the artist's Freudian urges? It's a different kind of thing. In fact, it's a much more creative act to try to interpret works in this way, way beyond what the artist intended to put into them. And he wanted to really distinguish those because he didn't want people attacking his theory that he's put forth in the interpreting works of art thing that we read in the Transformation of the Commonplace, which is again the same thesis by saying, interpretation is important to understanding a work at all. He didn't want that to be open to the kind of, attacks against relativism, against these kind of groundless, open-ended interpretations. You can give everything a Marxist or a Freudian interpretation or whatever.
Right. Which is obnoxious. The psychoanalytic interpretations are the most obnoxious. Not to say that there's not good work, but the sort of facile, let's analyze Hamlet, what was his Oedipal thing with his mother? I mean, it's so boring. Anyway.
You know what I find boring? Intent.
Your mom? I'm sorry.
What?
Intent.
The artist's intent?
Could care less.
About that?
Could care less. It is the starting point for any discussion or interpretation, if even to be included.
Yeah, I agree.
I think it's at least half the story. Again, one of these advances that he thought that Duchamp and Cage and these guys were going into was that, in fact, Duchamp liked the fact that you could interpret his ready-mades in many ways, that he thought that the artistic act is really as spectator, as critic. I don't want to interpret this wholly to him because this was mentioned in a number of places in the Bride and the Bachelors. Yeah, so it's really not, he was trying to get himself out of, I don't want to put myself, I'm going to pick things, anybody that uses chants. So John Cage a lot used chants in his composition or to try to get the artist's intent out of it, to really focus on the audience reaction. So that seems like what you're saying. I feel like it's 50-50 at least.
Well, here's one way of looking at that. You know, an author might make some sort of engage in conscious intentional symbolism, for instance, and that is interesting. But as a reader, it doesn't really matter whether the author intended it or not, because some of the symbolism is simply there, whether or not the author thought that it was there or not. You know, you could say it was done unconsciously, or you could say there are certain isomorphisms within the world. You know, you could treat the author for themselves as a medium, as channeling something.
Yeah, that's this deep,
and those
that's deep
symbolisms sort of transcend intention. So that's one way of approaching that. I mean, there are a lot of different.
I'm sorry, but my favorite example of this is me using a book to prop open a door.
It doesn't matter what the artist's intention was. It's fulfilling the purpose that you put forward to it.
That is exactly right. My interpretation of this thing is that it is heavy enough and has enough friction on its surface to hold the door open.
That's not an interpretation.
Well,
that's my use of it.
I'm one of the people that I like almost any movie better after I listen to part of the commentary track on the DVD.
I never listen to the commentary track.
No, I don't either. I don't have the energy for that.
I could care less. Now, there are circumstances where you could imagine, say, for example, you know that there's a story behind the story. So, like, for example, an actor or set of actors who you know have created an atmosphere behind the scenes that would be amusing and interesting.
I just watched the making of Caddyshack, which is fucking awesome.
I didn't know there was such a thing. That might be worth getting. But, like, the way these movies are now, you know, 90% of the commentary is about the special effects or how hard people trained to be able to do karate or whatever it is, the shit they're supposed to be doing. Granted, I'm not watching, like, you know, Mansfield Park all the time or anything. I did just watch G.I. Joe, Rise of Cobra the other night. Which, by the way, was even worse than the reviews. Like, I thought, well, how bad could it be?
Worse than Transformers 2?
I haven't seen Transformers 2.
That was pretty bad.
But
I could definitely do, like, the commentary for something like Apocalypse Now, where you know that
I had more in mind.
Here's where he had a heart attack and still went through the whole scene.
I had more in mind like the Judd Apatow movies, these comedies where they set up. It's like you're saying, where
who's he?
Every single thing they film, like Knocked Up and 40-Year-Old Virgin,
right.
and
that's great.
Anything that's like has a lot of improv in it. Then I like seeing. It's the same thing with those Christopher Guest movies, Best in Show and Waiting for Guffman and stuff. That like then to see what they were really doing. If you use improv that much, you're really taking maximum advantage of the amount of time you have to shoot, such that you're creating way too much material than would possibly be fun to sit and watch in one sitting. But that each of these little things is like, you know, itself a piece of art, a piece of improv, a piece of theater.
You know what this feels like to me? This feels like, you know, when people find like notebooks, like was it Wittgenstein? You know, they find the notebooks and you find like sort of proto versions of what becomes the final book.
Tolkien.
Like that to me is an academic exercise. And I think we established at the beginning of this podcast how I feel about academic exercises. But then again, maybe I'm just very much stuck in the world of expressionism, that I'm just looking for this film or book as a work of art to express something to me, and I don't care about the rest of it.
I'll just say, even a bad movie, if I watch the commentary sometime, I'll kind of like it because I can see where they were coming from, and I kind of appreciate it more from their point of view. Like, it's really purely utilitarian on my part. It's not that I'm like doing scholarship on these things. It's just that, okay, yeah, I actually see that that's kind of cool. And I do the same thing, you know, because I'm a musician, like I really approach other musicians the same way. Like, I don't like that almost everybody, when they talk about like, oh, Bob Dylan had his good early period, but then he kind of sucked. Or like everybody had a point where they sold out or they lost their verve or something. Like, I'm more likely to take the artist's perspective and kind of approach their work as a whole and them as, you know, somebody whose judgment I trust. And so I feel I get more appreciation. It's not a matter of, are these people wrong or am I right? The fact that most people are condemning 90% of music, for instance, or even 50% of music by some of their favorite artists. And I'm able to, you know, even take the shitty album that they recorded when they were taking too much cocaine in the early 80s, thinking of Neil Young here, for instance, and get something out of it like that. I'm the winner, right? I get the most enjoyment. I get the most utility out of it.
Yeah, but in that case, you're talking about appreciating still the work or the oeuvre the worst thing in the world is to listen to musicians talk about their music. Like, to have a musician explain a song is just, it's tedious. I mean, it's horrible. So I hear what you're saying. I just don't see those two things as being the same. And when a commentary becomes in itself a whole new narrative, like these little short makings of or behind the scenes, like Wes referenced the making of something, that in itself is a separate story. The idea of commentary on, if it's not ironic or comical, like Mystery Science Theater 3000,
Sure.
I'm not interested.
I gotta say, I did like,
but I also
Lord of the Rings.
And you apparently don't, Mark.
Well, I got the Lord of the Rings extended editions that each have like 4 or 5 commentaries on them. And I didn't listen to all 4 or 5 of them, but I listened to at least to, a couple of them.
Because what we really need to know is what Dominique Moynihan has to say about scene 27.
No, see, that's the thing.
I'm the only person on earth who didn't like those movies.
It's the writers and maybe the directors. If the directors talk too much about camera lenses, then fuck that. I don't care about that. But if it's talking about the concepts behind how was this adapted from a book into a movie, how is what, it just fascinates me. Anyway.
Well, yeah. But
what would Danto say?
I don't know. I don't know that we're still talking about a tent either anymore.
Let's call him up.
You could probably go track him down. He still live in New York?
Let's see if
before he reaches the end of Danto.
We'll see if he will listen to this.
You should send him a link. Send him a link.
I will be amazed enough if Jessica Barry, who recommended the reading, listens to this. So
I think Seth will listen to a commentary before she listens to this.
Have we reached the end?
Yes.
Do we need a roundup, or have we already said everything?
I would like to say a roundup.
Go ahead.
In summation, let me say again, I still was very energized by this reading, even though it doesn't have the kind of end game clarity that Mark may have preferred. I thought it was an interesting way of looking at things. I thought it was a way of making the philosophy of art, or art, relevant and mainstream to the study of philosophy. I think there are some subtexts, or at least undercurrents here, of kind of a smack in the face to contemporary philosophy, his contemporaries. I thought there was some very, very interesting. It was very well written. It was very understandable. It gives me a framework for understanding what happened in the 20th century in the art world that I did not previously have. As I mentioned, I had no access. Not that I spent a lot of time trying to understand what was going on, in 20th century art, but I didn't really have a framework for understanding it. That being said, like many others, there seems to be a conflation here of art with visual art, or at least painting, and that I'm not sure that his thesis holds for poetry, dance, or music. It's not for me to say. I just question from a progressive and representational standpoint, because I know that's really problematic. And I think maybe one day we'll read somebody else who talks about whether or not music can be representational and how it might be representational and so forth. But it would be an interesting exercise to know if the other art media follow this same progression in his mind. But I really enjoyed it, and I want to thank Jessica for bringing it to our attention, and this is fun stuff, and I'm glad we're doing it.
I guess I've said most of what I wanted to say. I'm a Danto fan now. I will turn back to him when we get to some of these other topics, when we talk about hermeneutics, his theory of meaning. So he has, even in this book, he has other essays on the text as opposed to the sentence, and theories of meaning and things that get too technical. I'm glad that we, are not asking our listeners to look at them or go into them in any depth. I mean, he's actually talking about Frege in some of it. So that tells you something. Just a name drop. He's just a very boring logician. Anyway, we'll do him sometime, I'm sure. But I found it pretty interesting to look into these modern artists and get more into what he thought of, what Warhol was all about, which is not as much as maybe I thought. And Duchamp and these other folks, I think he overstates their importance. I think there will always be times in the development of any, if you don't want to call it an art, call it a craft, come up with some other word for it. But yeah, when it gets sort of more or less pretentious and more or less self-reflective, and these things just go in waves and have endless variations within different subcultures and different media. And, if anything, he's pointed out some interesting patterns that have enriched my understanding of how these movements work. But I don't then get the same interpretation out of it that he does.
Yeah, I really enjoy it. I'm a Danto fan as well. And I'm going to read the rest of this. And this is my introduction to these alternatives between the more traditional, I guess, aesthetic, functional definitions of art, and then this more conventionalist, historical context, institutional context definitions. And some of the online stuff I read, there's this, I don't know, have you guys read David Davies? Is that his name?
Dave Davies. Dave Davies. Ray Davies' brother in the Kinks. Probably
anyway,
not.
So there's and Goodman, he's sort of
Nelson Goodman,
coming off of Nelson Goodman. Anyway, in the future, maybe we, I think they give it an alternative account, and that would be cool to do in the future and compare to Dante.
And we'll go back to more of these classical, like, what is art, aesthetics stuff, and some of the historical stuff, I'm sure, in future episodes. Hume is next time. But it's human epistemology, human theory of knowledge, the inquiry concerning human understanding. You can get a link to it at our website, partiallyexaminedlife.com. Please go to our website. Tell us what you think of what was going on today. It in some ways was criminal, even though I call myself sort of an artist because of the music thing, that we didn't have an actual visual artist who knows some stuff about this. So if there's anybody like that in the audience who wants to correct all of our errors, please come and do so on the Facebook page, on the blog. We welcome any and all of your comments. Maybe we'll read them on. Can I say this is on the air? In what sense it is on? It is not on the air in any sense. This is not being broadcast.
Yeah, it is.
No, it is going over wires. It is not on the air at all. That's what that means.
Well, unless someone is on satellite, right?
Let's say good nights. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Good night.
Good night.
On this night before the end, I'm feeling things that will not come again. I'm more than bold enough to bend. On this night before the end, I'm feeling something rather small. It may be nothing I don't feel at all. Not some dead mesmerizing calm. I answered long ago but dropped the ball. On this night before the end, I'm feeling things that will not come again. Let all good willingness descend to this night before the end. I keep something in my sight. It may be nothing but my appetite. I've got no dignity to fight. Maybe something, but it's not alright. On this night before the end, I'm feeling things that will not come again. I'm more than old enough to fend through this night before the end. Another 15 years or so, I suspected this was not a go. Kept getting tall but ceased to grow. Kept running out of things but not too slow. On this night before the end, I'm feeling things that will not come again. Some letters I forgot to send to this night before the end. Wait a minute, it may be nothing. I'm too young to die. Wait a minute, make it longer. I've passed you out goodbye. On this night before the end, I'm feeling things that will not come again. I'm more than bold enough to bend. On this night before the end. Wait a minute, it may be nothing. I'm too young to die. Wait a minute, make it longer. I've passed you out goodbye.
this night before the end, I'm feeling things that will not come again. I'm more than bold enough to bend on this night before the end. Wait a minute, it may be nothing. I'm too young to die. Wait a minute, make it longer. I'll pass you out goodbye. On this night before the end, on this night before the end, on this night before the end, I'm mostly bold enough to bend. On this night before the end, I'm feeling things that will not come again. I'm mostly cold enough to mend on this night